What's good, everyone? Anderson Emerald here, and USA's is coming up. By the time you're watching this, probably tomorrow, it'll be going down Thursday to Sunday in Eugene, Oregon. I've been doing predictions on all the sprints and the hurdles, but many of you noticed that I left off a good amount of NCAA athletes from my predictions. I don't have many NCAA athletes getting into my top three and making the team to the World Championships in Tokyo later this year. So today, I wanted to quickly just dive into 4 specific things. First off, some of the top athletes who are in the conversation to make the USA team to the World Championships this year. Also want to discuss the gap between the NCAA championships and USA's in terms of timeline, and also how it compares to previous years, 2019, 2023, et cetera, et cetera. I also want to note how often we've seen NCAA athletes actually make the USA team to the World Championships throughout the years. And I'm going to look over the past decade since 2015. And then finally, I'm going to talk about why I'm generally more hesitant about selecting NCAA athletes to make Team USA as it compares to some of the professional athletes that I usually do pick. Also, one thing to keep in mind, I'm going to be looking at USA championships and not Olympic trials for the United States. The only reason I'm separating them a little bit is, yes, they're both qualification meets for the global championships that year, but Olympic trials is a full week of competition. So some athletes will compete the first weekend and the next athletes will compete the following weekend. So that kind of changes the dynamics of an NCAA athlete preparing for Olympic trials versus 1 weekend or 4 days at NCAAs, 4 days at USA. So let's first dive in. There's a ton of athletes this year who are in the conversation to potentially make it on to Team USA for the World Championships this year. I think one of the most notable, Jordan Anthony, he's the NCAA indoor champion in the 60, outdoor champion in the 100. He ran that windy 9.75 seconds, shocked the world. He's entered in the 100 and the 200, so he's a contender there. Timar's McCallum from Tennessee, he's a world leader in the 200 this year, 19.73 seconds. Now, he only got 5th at NCAAs, but he also ran that 19.73, he ran 19.8, so he has a few times on the board. Also, in that 200, you have Garrett Colon, right? He's run 19.8. He was number 3 in the NCAA this year. Aaliyah Butler, one of the high-quality favorites that I actually picked for my team. 400 meters. She was the NCAA champion. She went to the Diamond Leagues, did all that. Jacoby Tharp in the men's 110 hurdles. You also have Jamesia Ford. She's run extremely fast, 21.8, I think, this year. You have Jacqueline Scott in the 4 hurdles. There's a ton of guys and women who are all in the conversation to potentially make the team for USA's. And many of these have a very strong argument as to why you would select them. I only selected maybe one of them, I think, to actually make the team, Aaliyah Butler. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but I just wanted to set the stage with a few of the athletes that people are calling for to say, hey, they can make the team. They might be in the conversation. They might challenge some of these pros. So those are some of the athletes. But they're facing some issues as it relates to the time gap between NCAAs when it finished off and then also when USA starts this coming weekend. In 2025, NCAAs ended the weekend of July 14th. USA's is starting this weekend. It starts on Thursday, but just the weekend of August 2nd, going from Saturday to Saturday. That's a 7-week gap between NCAAs and USA's. The last time this happened was in 2019, where there was 7 weeks between NCAAs in June all the way down to USA's in July of that year. In other years, it's been a much shorter gap. 2023, there was only 4 weeks in between. 2022, it was 2 weeks in between. 2019, like I said, 7 weeks. 2017, 2015, both of those were 2 weeks. And as I started to go back through the years, again, I only went through a full decade, but I look back, most of the time, it's actually been a 2-week gap between NCAAs and between USA championships. So why does this happen? Why is it that the gap between NCAAs and USA's will change, semi-frequently year after year? Well, this is generally set based on the World Championships that will go down that year, right? World Athletics, or the IAAF in the past, they would set a national championship window, and that would dictate when countries are able to host their national championships for that year. And they set that window so that it's not too early, so it won't conflict with meets that are going on the circuit, and it's not so far ahead of world champs, but it's also not too late so that it doesn't get too close to the world championships and again, conflict with, some meets on the circuit. Remember, World Athletics isn't necessarily focused on NCAAs. They're thinking about the professional circuit, right? They're thinking about the athletes who are competing with a full target on the World Championships. So in 2025, we have the World Championships at the tail end of the season in mid to late September, which was similar to the World Championships in Doha in 2019, when that occurred late September, early October. So you can see why USA's was significantly later, and we had 7 weeks between NCAAs and USA's. NCAAs almost exclusively is always about the second week or so of June. So they're not changing their date. They're kind of like set up based on, a lot of times the academic calendar and all those different things. So they're not changing, but USA's, that can change based on what World Athletics and IAAF does. So with that context, let's see how often NCAA athletes have actually gotten into the top 3 at USA's to potentially qualify to the World Championships after they're coming off their NCAA season. Now, a few things to keep in mind. At USA Championships, there's always 3 spots available for the men and women in each of the corresponding events, which totals up for 57 in each men and women, and then also for a full total of 114 spots, all together when talking about USA's. I'm going to ignore the idea of like qualifying marks. I'm just looking at top 3 because yes, there's many events where athletes don't have a qualifying mark, but we can just assume for the purposes like get top 3, that's going to get you onto the team. Also, I'm ignoring the idea of like a wild card or anything like that. Yes, it varies year to year. Some athletes have it, by being world champion, by being Diamond League champion. But my thought process is like, how many times have NCAA athletes finished in the top 3 at USA's to solidify their spot to, the world championships in that year? So looking from year to year over the past decade, 2023, 18 NCAA athletes across all events made it into the top 3 at USA's. And that was with 4 weeks in between NCAAs and USA's. 2022, when there was a 2-week gap, we saw 22 athletes actually finish in the top 3. Circle back to 2019, when there was a 7-year gap, that's when we saw 16 athletes finish in the top 3 at USA Championships that year. Circling back another 2 years, back to 2017, this is when we had a 2-year gap again. 23 athletes finished in the top 3 at USA's. And then finally, 2015, once again, a 2-year gap, 19 athletes from the NCAA qualified in the top 3 at USA's. So you can see there's a lot of variance across the board when talking about the athletes from the NCAA who actually went on to finish top 3. Again, ignoring qualifying marks, ignoring wild cards, like just the idea, finish top 3, and that's what I'm looking at if you're an NCAA athlete. So some initial thoughts. When you have a shorter time frame, it generally seems like it leads to more NCAA athletes finishing in the top 3. So in 2022 and 2017, a 2-week gap that led to, over 20 athletes from the NCAA actually finishing in the top 3. Now, I guess it's a caveat. I'm only looking at a decade, but 2015, there was a 2-week gap and we only saw 19 athletes. Now, to be fair, that's still higher than 2019 and 2023, but little caveat there. But I guess you can say it tends to favor athletes if there is a shorter gap. And I think most people can say that makes sense, right? If athletes are peaking for NCAAs, the shorter time frame from then to USA's is probably going to favor them a little bit more, instead of having so many weeks off where you peak for NCAAs, you have to go back down and then come right back up to prepare to qualify once again. What I also did notice and kind of break down was the differences between each of the events. So for example, as you can see here, the sprints actually tend to do relatively well on both the men's and the women's side. For example, when talking about the sprints, in total over the decade, we've seen about 11 NCAA athletes qualify. Similar situation on the women's sprints, you have about 13 athletes qualify. And you can combine that with the hurdles, where on the women's side, if you have sprints and hurdles, that gives you a total of 18. On the men's side, that for sprints and hurdles, that gives you a total of 18 as well. So pretty good numbers there. But on the distance side, that's where it seems like NCAA athletes tend to struggle, where you have men's mid-distance and distance, you have a total of 8. Women's, similar situation, actually even worse, where you have a total of 2 over a decade. And this seems to indicate that more professionals or non-NCAA athletes are able to hold their positions as it relates to finishing top 3 compared to NCAA athletes actually breaking into that top 3. Also, in the field events, athletes tend to do really, really well, right? So for example, women's field events, throws, jumps, and multis, you have 25 athletes over the decade. On the men's side, you have similar situation where you're looking at 27 athletes over the decade. So this is a pretty big number, sizable number across the board. Now, it's relatively equal if we total things up across the board, where 27 on the men's side in terms of the field events, whereas you have 26 on the men's side for the running events, sprints, hurdles, and distance. And then similar situation for the women, where in total on the running events, you have 20. And then here you have about 25 for the women in the field. So, women maybe a little bit more on the field, men a little bit equal on that side. Also important to note is there's some athletes who are duplicates, meaning they've made the team in multiple events at the same championships. So as an example, in 2017, we actually saw Christian Coleman qualify in both the 100 and the 200 meters when it comes to USAs that year. Similar situation we saw with Jasmine Moore, who qualified in both the long jump and the triple jump, not only in 2023, but she actually did the exact same thing in 2022 as well. Also, I think 2015, we saw Marquise Dendy. He qualified in both the long jump and he was down in the triple jump as well. So you have a few athletes who, for my purposes, I did count them twice, but you would, in theory, remove them, taking one number away, because it's one athlete qualifying in two events versus, multiple athletes qualifying in the multiple events. So slight differences as it relates to those athletes there. So just some interesting numbers and data to take a look at. Again, I was just comparing the past decade of NCAA athletes, and I think there's a few key takeaways for me, which generally still gives me pause as it relates to picking NCAA athletes to qualify specifically for the 2025 USA Championships coming up this weekend. First off, the gap between NCAAs and USAs clearly means that less athletes are going to qualify relative to previous years. So we have a 7-week gap between when NCAAs ended, and that means that athletes are peaked for NCAAs, they had to dip back down, and now they're coming back up to prepare to qualify and finish top 3 at USAs. That is a challenge for many NCAA athletes across the board. Not all of them, because we've seen historically, going back to 2019, where there was many NCAA athletes who were able to qualify. But it is going to be a challenge for the majority of athletes, which makes me less likely to actually pick them to make the team. So that's something to really think about. The other thing that's important is the overwhelming majority of athletes who actually make it on the team are still pro or just non-NCAA athletes. Yes, I've noted that there's a couple, who do actually make it every single year. And yes, in 2017, 23 NCAA athletes actually did qualify and finish top 3 at least, for at USAs. But that is a minority across the board. Remember, there's 114 spots on both the men's and the women's side in combination in all the events. When you look at how many athletes actually make it, it's still the majority just professional athletes actually making it. In 2023, 96 out of 114. And if we look at the rest of the years, it's all in the 90s. And again, that doesn't exclude the NCAA athletes, but I think just the perspective of most athletes who are making it are professionals. Now, I think there's some context that's needed where most athletes who are competing at USAs are not NCAA athletes. They make up just the, minority of athletes who are actually competing. But when we're talking about the ones who are competing, they're probably going to be the better, the top NCAA athletes for the most part who are going to be at USAs. But when I'm putting them up against the top professional athletes and saying, all right, they're going to beat out some of the top guys or top women to make the team, I'm still going to favor some of the pros, where things like experience, I favor experience very, very heavily. Yes, you can compete against some of the top NCAA athletes. You can run some very fast times, but that is a different experience than competing week after week or month after month against the top professionals, not only in the United States, but also across the world, and athletes who have a ton of experience in previous years as well. If someone like T-Mars McCallum, yes, he's run extremely fast. He has the world lead, 19.7, but he hasn't actually faced any of the top competition that he'll be racing against at the USA Championships, like a Noah Lyles, like a Kenny B, like an Ariane. All those guys who, 3 guys who I named who all have at minimum a silver medal at the World Championships or the Olympic Games. That's the competition that T-Mars is going to have to face off against. If I'm comparing him to someone like Courtney Lindsay, who hasn't run as fast as T-Mars yet, but Courtney, he's been competing frequently this year and in previous years against many of these guys, whether it's Noah Lyles, Kenny B, Ariane Knighton, Fred Curley, Letsila Teboho, or any other guy who's on the circuit who are professionals and running those 19.7, 8, 9 very consistently week after week. That is a different level of experience that I'm personally going to favor. And when I see T-Mars run a fast time, he ran 19.8 earlier in the year, but then he came to NCAAs and he finished 5th place. What does that mean? And then afterwards, he finished 19.7. What does that mean when he goes up against, he's in a lane next to Kenny B, next to Noah Lyles? Like, how is he going to respond to those guys? They're comfortable. They know what to do. They've been here. They've been at Worlds. They've been at Olympics. But T-Mars, this is a different scenario for him. So just that context is why I favor experience a little bit more. You can do time trials. And again, this is not to diminish an athlete in any way, but when you're actually lining up, you cannot replicate the feeling of being right next to Noah Lyles. I've heard professional athletes tell me, yo, this other athlete was in my lane and I was like, yo, and I'm talking about professional athletes talking about other professionals. So an NCAA athlete compared to another professional, that mindset is going to be a little bit different. Again, many athletes do it very well, but I'm more likely to favor some of the professionals compared to some of the NCAA athletes. So just wanted to provide that context. But as I said, I would not be shocked if any of these top NCAA athletes actually do make the team, because we've seen it happen many years, right? Year after year across the board in different capacities, whether it's Grant Holloway and Daniel Roberts making it in 2019 at USA's, or Abby Steiner and Britton Wilson doing it in 2022, or even Courtney Lindsay in 2023. There's been so many athletes who have been able to actually finish top 3 and secure their spot to a world championships. So when I look at this year with someone like a Jordan Anthony, yes, I feel like he has the ability to make the team in the 100, but I'm not going to pick a Jordan Anthony ahead of a Kenny B or a Trayvon Bromell. I think someone like Jordan Anthony, I wouldn't be surprised if he made the team, but I also wouldn't be surprised if he, didn't make the team or didn't even make the final, right? I think these things can hold true at the same time. Similar situation with a T-Mars McCallum. Yes, he can make the team, but I would kind of be surprised if he finished ahead of Noah Lyles, Kenny B, Courtney Lindsay. I would kind of be surprised, but not to say, oh, if he finishes top 3, it can make sense because of the times that he's run. I already have someone like Aaliyah Butler on my team, but the difference is she's actually competed, she's actually made teams, she's competed on the circuit against top professionals relatively frequently, whether it's at Prefontaine, whether it's at the Monaco Diamond League. So that level of experience, I'm going to favor a little bit more. Similar with Jacoby Tharp in the 110 hurdles. He's gone overseas to compete a little bit with some of the professionals and he's held his own. So I'm going to favor that a little bit more. Similar to like a Grant Holloway, Daniel Roberts, 2019, they both went overseas and they eventually went on to make Team USA after that. So this is just my general thoughts as it relates to some of the NCAA athletes. Again, I pulled some of this data very quickly. I only looked at the past 10 years because I wasn't going to, go through everything. But let me know what you think. Hopefully this provides some context as to my thinking about picking NCAA athletes to make the team for USA's, and also just some historical, data and some thought processes around how often athletes make the team. But let me know what you think. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel. Truly appreciate y'all. Thanks for watching.